The little village of Seabrick had a soul made of salt and stubbornness. It was a place where the houses clung to the cliffs like determined muscles, their paint perpetually faded by the sea spray, and the people spoke in the same gruff, rhythmic language as the ocean itself. They understood that the sea was both life and death, a generous provider and a furious, unforgiving master. On this particular evening, the master was in a rage. The sky, which had been a gentle, hazy blue just hours before, had curdled into a bruised purple and angry gray. The wind, once a soft whisper through the dune grass, now screamed like a banshee, tearing at rooftops and whipping the sea into a frenzy of white-capped mountains. This was not a storm to be weathered lightly. This was the kind of storm that carved new shapes into the coastline and old fears into the hearts of sailors. Out on that churning, black water, a single boat fought a battle it was destined to lose. The Sea Serpent was a sturdy vessel, but no match for the fury of the open ocean. At its helm was Cassian, a man as solid and unyielding as the granite cliffs of his home. His hands, rough and calloused from years of hauling nets and wrestling ropes, gripped the wheel with all his strength, his knuckles white. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with a mix of salt spray and cold sweat. He had spent his entire life reading the moods of the sea, but this storm had come up with a deceptive speed, a trap laid by nature itself. A monstrous wave, taller than his mast, rose up from the darkness and slammed into the Sea Serpent with the force of a giant's fist. The world exploded into noise and cold. The deck bucked violently beneath his feet, and the sound of splintering wood was swallowed by the roar of the wind. Icy water, black as ink, swallowed him whole, pulling him down into a silent, freezing darkness. His last conscious thought was not of fear, but of a grim, familiar acceptance. This was how it would end. The sea he loved would finally claim him, just as the villagers had always whispered it would, for a man with a heart as closed off as his was not meant for a gentle passing. In a small, wind-battered cottage perched precariously on the cliff's edge, a new resident was learning the true power of a Seabrook storm. Anya had come here to escape a different kind of tempest, one of loud city noises and a quiet, aching loneliness that had settled deep in her bones. She had hoped the constant rhythm of the waves would soothe the jagged edges inside her. But this was not soothing. The windows rattled in their frames, and the whole little house seemed to groan under the assault. Drawn by a nervous energy, she peered out the rain-lashed window, her breath fogging the cold glass. Down in the harbor, she could see the frantic, bobbing lights of the rescue boats, tiny fireflies against an immense, angry void. And then she saw it, a single, fleeting flash of lightning illuminated a horrifying scene far out past the breakwater, a small boat being smashed to pieces against the jagged teeth of the Razor rocks, and a lone figure, a dark speck, disappearing beneath a crushing wave. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the storm's symphony. Without a conscious plan, without a single thought for her own safety, she acted. She threw on her coat, the wind nearly tearing the door from its hinges as she wrenched it open, and ran out into the gale. The rain stung her face like 1,000 tiny needles. She stumbled and slid down the muddy path leading to the shore, her mind screaming one single, clear thought. Someone is out there. On the beach, chaos reigned. Fishermen shouted to one another, their voices torn away by the wind, pointing desperately at the rocks. Their larger boats couldn't get close without sharing the same fate. Anya's eyes scanned the shore, and she spotted it, an old, weathered dinghy, pulled high up on the sand, half full of rainwater. It was a crazy, suicidal idea. But it was the only one. Summoning a strength she didn't know she possessed, she pushed and dragged the heavy wooden boat into the surf. The freezing water soaked her instantly, stealing her breath. She clambered in, grabbing the oars with numb hands, and began to row. Each pull was a battle. The waves tried to spin her, to push her back to shore, to capsize her completely. Salt water filled her mouth and nose. Her muscles screamed in protest, burning with a fire that fought the deep cold seeping into her core. She focused only on the spot where she had seen the man, rowing with a desperate, single-minded fury that the storm itself could not match. Somehow, through a miracle of sheer will, she reached him. He was barely clinging to a splintered piece of his mast, his face a pale, ghostly mask in the darkness, his movements sluggish. He was giving up. No, she yelled, her voice a raw, thin sound against the wind. Leaning precariously over the side, she grabbed the collar of his heavy oilskin jacket. He was a massive, dead weight, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he would pull them both under. With a final, guttural cry of effort, she hauled him partway into the boat, his upper body slumped over the side, the water draining from his clothes. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow. The journey back was a blur of exhaustion and terror. She used the storm's own power, riding the waves back toward the beach where strong hands now waited, having seen her impossible mission. They pulled the dinghy ashore, and Cassian was lifted out, a sodden, lifeless-looking form. They carried him to his own small, sparse cabin a short way up from the beach. Anya followed, her own body shaking uncontrollably, guided by the villagers. She refused to leave. She helped the local women strip off his wet clothes and wrap him in thick, rough wool blankets. They built a roaring fire in the hearth, and the room slowly began to warm. Hours passed. Anya sat in a wooden chair by his bed, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest, her own heart finally beginning to calm. The storm outside was weakening, its anger spent. As the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the single window, his eyes fluttered open. They were a startling shade of sea green, clouded with confusion and pain. They focused on her, the stranger in his home. He took in her tired face, her damp, tangled hair. His brow furrowed, not in gratitude, but in a deep, defensive scowl. His voice, when it came, was a low, gravelly rasp, weakened but firm. "You," he coughed, wincing. "You shouldn't have risked your life for me." The words hung in the air, a challenge, a warning, the first words of their story. The days that followed the great storm were a time of quiet tension, a different kind of battle fought not with wind and waves, but with silence and stubborn pride. Cassian's cabin became the stage for this new conflict. It was a place as rugged and untamed as the man himself, smelling of wood smoke, salt, and old wool. Every surface was practical, with no room for softness or decoration. And into this masculine world, Anya had inserted herself like a persistent, gentle tide, washing up against the stony shore of his personality each day and slowly, imperceptibly, wearing him down. His injury, a deep, angry gash on his forearm from the splintered wreck of his boat, was his official reason for needing help, but it was also his greatest source of humiliation. For a man like Cassian, whose entire identity was built upon his strength and his ability to provide for and protect himself, being rendered helpless was a poison. And the fact that his rescuer was a woman, a complete stranger from a world he couldn't begin to understand, made the medicine even more bitter. He saw her not as a savior, but as a living, breathing reminder of his own vulnerability, a crack in the solid armor he had spent a lifetime constructing. So, he met her daily visits with a wall of grunts and dismissive gestures. When she arrived with a basket containing fresh bandages and a pot of soup, he would stare fixedly out the window, as if the view of the choppy grey sea was the most fascinating thing in the world. "The village has a nurse. You don't have to do this," he'd mutter, the first time she unwrapped the old bandage. His voice was like the grind of stones on the beach. "She's busy with old man Hemlock's fever," Anya would reply, her voice calm and even, not rising to meet his gruffness. She worked with a quiet efficiency, her fingers surprisingly steady and sure as she cleaned the wound. She didn't flinch at the sight of the torn flesh or try to make comforting, empty chatter. Her silence was a counterpoint to his. His was heavy, meant to push her away. Hers was light, a simple acceptance of the task at hand. On the third day, after she had finished rebandaging his arm, she didn't immediately leave. Instead, she moved to his small, cluttered kitchen area and began to quietly wash the few dishes that had accumulated in the sink. The sound of the clinking pottery and the splash of water was strangely loud in the quiet cabin. Cassian watched her from his chair by the fire, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation. "I can manage my own mess," he stated, his voice tight. "I know you can," she said simply, not turning around. "But you shouldn't have to with one good arm." She finished, dried her hands, and then took a small, leather-bound book from her basket and sat in the chair opposite him. She didn't speak to him, simply opened the book and began to sketch, the soft scratching of her pencil the only sound. This became the new pattern. She would arrive, tend to his arm, perform some small act of tidying, sweeping the hearth, airing out his damp blankets, and then she would sit and sketch. She was a patient fisher of men, and she was casting a very long, very quiet line. Cassian, for his part, was completely disarmed by this strategy. He knew how to fight anger with greater anger. He knew how to build his walls higher when faced with a direct assault. But he had no defense against this quiet persistence, this unwavering, gentle presence that asked for nothing and gave so freely. He began, almost against his will, to notice small things about her. The way a little furrow of concentration appeared between her eyebrows when she focused on her drawing. The way she would sometimes hum a soft, unfamiliar tune under her breath while she worked. He found himself leaving the door unlatched in the mornings, a silent invitation. He started putting 2 mugs by the kettle instead of 1. The turning point came on a rainy afternoon a week later. Anya had been called away to help the nurse and had left her sketchbook behind on the chair. Cassian, restless and bored, paced the small cabin, his eyes continually drifting to the book. It felt like a violation, a private world he had no right to enter. But his curiosity was a physical ache. What could she possibly find to draw day after day in this dull cabin? Finally, with a feeling of guilt tightening his chest, he walked over and picked it up. The leather was soft and worn. He opened it. His breath caught in his throat. The pages were not filled with the seascapes or village scenes he expected. They were filled with him. But not the Cassian he knew, the gruff and closed-off fisherman. She had drawn him sleeping in his chair by the fire, the lines of worry on his face smoothed away in sleep, making him look younger, almost peaceful. Another page showed just his hands, resting on his knees, the scars and calluses rendered with such detail and respect they looked like a map of a hard-lived life, not just ugly marks. There was a sketch of him looking out the window, his profile strong against the light, but in her lines, his expression wasn't one of anger or sullenness, but of a deep, profound longing. She had seen past the fortress walls he had built around himself and had drawn the man she glimpsed hiding inside. She had seen not a monster, but a person. A person worthy of being seen. He was still standing there, the book held in his hands as if it were made of glass, when the door opened and Anya stepped in, shaking the rain from her coat. She saw the open sketchbook in his hands and froze, a flush of color rising to her cheeks. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the only sound the gentle patter of rain on the roof. Cassian expected her to be angry, to snatch the book away. He prepared for the storm. But it didn't come. Instead, he carefully closed the book and placed it back on the chair. He took a slow, deep breath, the fight finally draining out of him. He met her gaze, and for the first time, his sea-green eyes held no storm, only a quiet, bewildered wonder. The ghost of a smile, the first real one she had ever seen on his face, touched his lips. It transformed him entirely. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and soft, like the sound of the tide turning. "You see things," he said, "that others don't." It wasn't an apology, or a thank you. It was something far more important. It was an acknowledgement. It was the sound of a lock beginning to turn. A new season began in Seabrook, one not marked on any calendar but felt in the very air of Cassian's cabin and in the quiet spaces between their words. The wall that had stood between them, once as solid and cold as granite, had crumbled, not with a dramatic crash, but with the gentle persistence of a spring thaw. It was replaced by a fragile, blooming thing, a tentative trust that grew stronger with each passing day. Cassian's silence was no longer a weapon, it became a comfortable shared space, a language they both understood. He began to talk, his words at first like rare, precious stones, slowly mined from a deep place within him. He told her about his father, a fisherman like him, and the way the sea had claimed him years ago. He spoke of the lonely years that followed, of building his life around the tides and the catch, believing that was all there was for a man like him. Anya, in turn, shared her own story, sitting with him by the fire in the evenings. She spoke of the city not with hatred, but with a quiet sadness, describing a life that felt like a beautiful, empty painting. She talked of a love that had promised everything but had been built on sand, washing away at the first sign of a real storm, leaving her feeling hollow and unseen. "I came here," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper, "because I thought the noise of the ocean might be loud enough to drown out the quiet inside me." Cassian listened, his large, work-roughened hand resting near hers on the table, a silent promise that he heard her, that he saw the quiet places she spoke of. Their world began to gently expand beyond the four walls of the cabin. On a day when the sun shone with a gentle, golden light and the sea was a placid, shimmering blue, Cassian took her down to the shore where his new boat, the Anya's Hope *, was moored. The name was painted freshly on the side in bold, white letters. He had not told her, had not made a grand announcement, he simply led her to it and watched her face. When she saw it, her hands flew to her mouth, and her eyes filled with tears that were not of sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming understanding. He was rebuilding, and he was building her into his future. That day, he took her out on the water, his hand steady on the tiller, the other pointing out the secret geography of his world. He showed her the hidden coves where the seals basked on sunny rocks, the deep channels where the silver-scaled fish ran thick, and the underwater forests of kelp that swayed with the current. He was giving her the map to his heart, piece by piece. The romance that blossomed between them was not one of grand, dramatic gestures, but of 1,000 small, breathtaking intimacies. It was in the way his hand would find the small of her back to guide her over a slippery rock on the shore. It was in the way she would automatically reach for his mug to refill it with tea when she filled her own. It was in the way he started leaving a single, perfect shell on the windowsill for her every morning, a tiny treasure found just for her. It was in the way she began to mend his clothes, her neat, careful stitches a visible claim of care on his worn, practical garments. They walked for miles on the beach as the sun set, their fingers laced together, their shadows merging into one long silhouette on the wet sand. He no longer walked ahead, he walked beside her. One evening, as a spectacular sunset painted the sky in fiery shades of orange and violet, they sat on a driftwood log, watching the light dance on the water. The air was warm and still, the only sound the gentle shush of the waves on the sand. Cassian was quiet for a long time, looking out at the horizon where the sky met the sea. Then, he turned to her, his sea-green eyes clear and deep, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch. "My whole life," he began, his voice low and earnest, "I felt like I was in a constant storm. Always fighting, always bracing for the next wave. I was so used to the noise and the chaos inside me, I thought it was just who I was." He paused, reaching out to tuck a stray strand of her hair behind her ear, his touch sending a shiver through her. "But you are the first calm thing I've ever known. When I'm with you, the water is still. When I'm with you, I can finally hear the silence, and it's not empty. It's peaceful. You're my anchor, Anya. You keep me steady." The words hung in the air, more meaningful and binding than any formal declaration of love. They were a confession from the deepest, most protected part of his soul. Anya felt her own eyes well up, seeing the raw, unguarded truth in his face. She didn't answer with words. She simply leaned forward, her hand coming up to cradle his jaw, her thumb gently stroking his cheek. She closed the small distance between them and pressed her lips to his. It was not a hesitant kiss, nor a wild, passionate one. It was a kiss of profound understanding, of homecoming. It was a soft, lingering promise that spoke of past hurts soothed and a future being built, together. It was the quiet, powerful seal on a bond that had been forged in a storm and tempered in the calm, a love as deep and enduring as the sea itself. The golden, sun-drenched days that followed their first kiss felt like a dream from which Anya never wanted to wake. The world itself seemed to have taken on a new, brighter hue. The salt in the air tasted sweeter, the cry of the gulls was a joyful song, and the rhythm of the waves against the shore was the steady, reassuring heartbeat of her new life. Cassian, once a man of few words and guarded expressions, now seemed to have an endless supply of soft smiles and gentle touches reserved just for her. They fell into a beautiful, shared rhythm, their two separate lives weaving together as seamlessly as the strands of a well-made net. Mornings were for shared chores, afternoons for long walks where they planned a small garden behind the cabin, and evenings for sitting by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm a warm, heavy weight around her. She had never known such a profound sense of belonging, of being exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the person she was meant to be with. It was a peace so deep it felt sacred. This perfect peace was broken one afternoon by a simple, official-looking envelope that arrived in the post. It was addressed to Anya, forwarded from her old address in the city. Curious, she opened it at the small kitchen table while Cassian mended a net outside the window. As she read the formal letter, her breath hitched. It was from the prestigious Lauron Gallery, a place she had desperately submitted her portfolio to over a year ago, a lifetime ago. They had seen her newer work online, the sweeping seascapes and intimate sketches of life in Seabrook, and they were offering her a solo exhibition. It wasn't just an opportunity, it was the dream she had held since she was a young girl, the very dream she had believed was dead and buried. It was a validation of her talent on the grandest stage she could imagine. And it required her to return to the city for at least 3 months to prepare. A cold dread, entirely separate from the excitement that also fluttered in her chest, instantly took root in her stomach. She walked outside, the letter trembling in her hand. Cassian looked up from his work, his smile fading the moment he saw her face. Wordlessly, she handed him the letter. He read it slowly, his rough hands careful with the expensive paper. She watched his face, seeing the emotions play out in his sea-green eyes, first confusion, then understanding, and finally, a carefully constructed neutrality that was more painful to her than any anger could have been. He handed the letter back to her, his gaze dropping to the net in his hands. "This is what you wanted," he stated, his voice flat. "Before you came here. This is everything you worked for." The following days were a slow, quiet agony. A gray fog of uncertainty settled over the cabin, choking out the recent joy. Anya was torn in two. One part of her, the artist who had struggled for so long to be seen, screamed that this was a chance that would never come again. The other part, the woman who had found her home and her heart in Cassian's arms, wept at the thought of leaving. She tried to talk to him about it, but he had retreated, building a new wall, not of anger this time, but of a heartbreaking, resigned sadness. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was not enough to hold her. He was a simple fisherman, and her world was about to become one of glamour and acclaim. He loved her too much to be the anchor that kept her ship in the harbor when it was meant to sail. The tension came to a head one evening. Anya, her heart aching with the unspoken words between them, finally broke the silence. "I don't know what to do, Cassian," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. He was standing by the fireplace, his broad back to her. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally turned, the look on his face was one of pure, selfless love, a love so strong it was willing to break its own heart. "A real love," he said, his voice low and fervent, "doesn't put you in a cage, Anya. It doesn't hold you back. It gives you wings." He crossed the room and took her hands in his grip firm and sure. "If you need to go, if this is a part of you that you need to answer, then you have to go. I will be here. This cabin, my heart, it's yours. Always. It will be waiting for you when you get back." His words were the key that unlocked her own certainty. In that moment, as he offered her his blessing and his unwavering faith, she saw the truth with perfect clarity. She looked around the small, sturdy cabin, at the shell collection on the windowsill, at the sketchbook on the table filled with drawings of the man who had just given her the greatest gift of her life. She thought of the noisy, crowded city, the lonely applause at a gallery opening, the empty apartment that was not a home. She thought of the difference between a dream you chase for fame, and a life you build for love. Her choice became as clear and as certain as the North Star. She reached up and placed her hands on either side of his face, forcing him to look into her eyes, to see the absolute truth shining in them. "Cassian," she said, her voice steady and strong. "That old dream was about being seen by the world. It was about being famous." A single, happy tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "But my new dream, the only one that matters, is about being happy. It's about being home. And you are my home. You are my happiness." She watched as the fear and sadness in his eyes melted away, replaced by a wave of such profound relief and joy that it took her breath away. "I'm not going anywhere." The final scene was one of perfect, peaceful completion. They stood together on their stretch of beach, the very same shore where their story had begun in violence and chaos, now bathed in the soft, forgiving light of a rising moon. The water was calm, whispering secrets to the sand. His arm was around her, holding her tightly against his side, her head resting on his shoulder. Their hands were linked, their fingers intertwined, a tangible symbol of two separate lives now permanently and joyfully joined. They had both been lost, adrift in their own lonely storms, until they found each other. They had discovered a love that was strong enough to handle the fiercest gales and deep enough to be their anchor in any sea. It was a love that had been tested, and a love that had chosen, irrevocably, to stay. If this story of a love forged in stormy seas and strengthened by quiet mornings touched your heart, then you won't want to miss the journey of other souls finding their way home. Subscribe to the channel to be swept away by more timeless tales of connection, courage, and the kind of romance that changes lives forever. Your next unforgettable story is just one click away.